right, welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the last kind of big idea in this whole evolution unit that we've been working on, which is the idea of how do new species come along. So we've been talking about natural selection. We've taken a look at changes in gene pools and how that can change. But how do we actually get to new different kinds of creatures that are showing up in the world? And that's kind of the crux of the whole deal that a lot of people really don't understand, is how is it that slow changes in gene populations, can eventually result in completely different species happening over time. So, in terms of what this is, first thing you got to understand what a species actually is. And the BSC here stands for the biological species concept. There's a couple of different ways to define what a species is. We're going to use this particular way. And a biological species is simply a group of organisms that can and do successfully reproduce in their natural environment. There's a variety of things that can violate this, but that idea that they can reproduce, they do reproduce, and they're in their natural environment, not say like a zoo or something else that's artificially created in those kinds of cases. The kind of that bottom phrase that's on there, kind of a key phrase. Species tend to be reproductively isolated from other populations. In other words, they can only reproduce within their own group. They cannot reproduce with others outside the group for a variety of different reasons that we'll go to later on in this particular video. So even though it looks kind of weird, this Great Dane and this teeny tiny Chihuahua are the same species. Yeah, I don't want you to think about it too deeply, but they can interbreed, and they would interbreed, and they do live in their same environment, so therefore they're considered to be the same species. Kind of overall, what does it mean to become different species? Well, you start off with a single group. Some sort of barrier is established. We don't know necessarily what, but for whatever reason, these two populations start to diverge. They come apart from one another, and then eventually they become incompatible. They become isolated from one another, and at that point in time, as soon as they're isolated, then we can now call them two separate species. And oftentimes that has to do with some different characteristics that we could see, like these guys have funky ears and tails and things like that. This does not mean that cats and dogs came from the same environment. I know it looks like that, but that's what the process of speciation means, that they used to be one. Some point in time there was diversity due to different selective pressures or whatever, and then somehow they became isolated from one another. So, in general, when we're talking about natural selection and how it relates to the idea of species, we got to kind of think about there's three different kind of ways that natural selection can shift traits in a population. So, if you take a look at these are sort of three real general things. I'll go into each one of these in a little bit more detail. But if you've got an original population, like this group of mice that have some sort of a trait, this one, it's a phenotype of fur color, it could be size, it could be weight, it could be all kinds of different things. But there's an original population there, and if we apply some selective pressure to these things, one of three things can happen. Either we could say, hey, the average individuals, the one in the middle, are the most advantageous. We would call that stabilizing. We could say, you know what, the ones towards one side are the most advantageous. We'd call that directional. Or we could say the ones in the middle are the worst, and the ones on either side are okay. We would call that disruptive. So let's take a look at what some examples of each one of these particular things. So, stabilizing selection, again, stabilizing means at the center, the most average individuals are the ones that are the most advantageous. And this is an example of what's happening with some prickly pear cactus, actually. This is a real example from the United States, that there's some creatures, these little pig-like creatures are called peccaries, little peckers, and then there's a wasp. So there's two separate types of forces that are both working on this cactus. The peccaries tend to eat the cactuses with the least number of spines, whereas the wasps tend to parasitize, and I'll let you read at the bottom how that works. They tend to parasitize the ones with the greatest number of spines. So having few spines is a disadvantage, having a lot of spines is a disadvantage, and so what we see over time is that there's sort of an averaging, that this middle number of spines, around 80 or 90 or so, tends to become more and more common over time. And that's called stabilizing selection. We don't see it shifting one way or the other, shifting towards the center. Second version is called directional selection, and this is shifting towards one side, where for some reason one end of the spectrum is a disadvantage and the other end is an advantage. We have definitely seen this in horses over millions and millions of years. Turns out horses used to be about the size of a fairly decent sized dog. Can you imagine a horse the size of a black lab? Kind of cool, right? But over time, we see that in the species fossil record that the horses get larger and larger and larger. They're definitely shifting in one direction, and we would call that directional selection. We see this in humans as well, that the average size of humans humans has been getting taller over time. A couple million years ago, average height was about 4'6", and now we're talking about average height in the 5'10" range, to a little bit taller than that even. Here's an example with birds over here that, depending on the year, whether it's wet or dry, and the seeds that they have, there could be directional selection towards a larger beak or a smaller beak. That if it's a dry year, they tend directionally towards a larger beak, and if it's a wetter year, they tend towards a smaller beak. Again, directional selection could be either direction. Both of the examples on here tend to shift kind of towards the right on the graph, but you could shift towards smaller. For example, if larger prey got eaten first, all the little prey would end up getting smaller and smaller over time as those ones survived. Last one, disruptive selection. Disruptive selection means the middle part is a disadvantage for whatever reason. So like with our birds here, what we could say is, for example, maybe at the same year that there's small seeds and large seeds, but no medium-sized seeds. Then there would be an advantage to either having a big beak or a tiny beak, but not a medium-sized beak. And that would be a type of disruptive selection. With the butterflies down at the bottom, you could have the females here that are on this dark end of the spectrum. They're representing or looking like something that's unpalatable. In other words, very not delicious, so they do not get preyed upon. The females on this side of the spectrum represent or look like a different non-delicious species. And then in the middle here, where you've got this sort of heterozygous condition, they are delicious and unfortunately don't look like anything that's not delicious. Therefore, they're going to get picked off. It's not a camouflage issue. It's just that they don't look like something that's not tasty. I don't know if that makes sense or not. But the ones on the left and the ones on the right both don't look tasty. The ones in the middle do look tasty, and so the ones in the middle get picked off. And again, this is that idea of disruptive selection. This is the one kind of factor, disruptive selection, that's the most likely in a fairly short amount of time to end up in two separate species. Directional selection can end up in different species over long periods of time, but in this particular case, disruptive selection can make two species relatively quickly. So in terms of how this works, you've got a fish population up here, and there's a couple of different ways that we could get disruptive. It's not automatic. What we're trying to look for, again, is that idea of reproductive isolation that I said way back in that first slide. You've got to eventually get that inability to interbreed in order to be able to say two new species. Now, there's a couple of different ways. In the left here, this allopatric speciation, it's a crazy word, isn't it? Allopatric means different places. But allopatric speciation, these are now reproductively isolated because they simply can't meet. Literally, there's the blue ones in the left pond and the brown ones in the right pond. They can't get together, so they can't reproduce in their natural environment. So we could almost consider these guys to be separate species if it lasts long enough. These ones here in the middle, this is sympatric. The word sympatric means same place. As opposed to allopatric means different place. But now we've got this difference in coloration, for example, that maybe the blue ones don't recognize the brown ones as being mating partners. So maybe they stop reproducing with each other. So again, this is different kinds of disruptive selection. But you put a barrier in there of some sort, either by choice or by geography, and we can get some different kinds of species forming. So let's take a look a little bit more in depth into allopatric and sympatric speciation, some of the different ways that this can occur. So geographic isolation is the easiest one to understand. Two species go different places, and they change for whatever reason, but they simply do not come into contact with one another. And of course, we've got lions and tigers. They can make ligers, awesomest creature ever, or tigons, depending on who's mom and dad. But because lions and tigers live in different regions, they're considered to be different species. They could, but they don't reproduce because they're not in their native environment. If we put them in a zoo together, make them desperate, they can interbreed, but they would never interbreed out in the wild. In fact, they live in different continents. One's in Africa and one's in Asia. So they're separate, geographic isolation. In California, there's an interesting case that's happened with salamanders, where literally some salamanders went on one side of the mountains, some other salamanders went on the other side of the mountains. So they were geographically isolated for long enough. Plus some genetic drift, they started kind of shifting their characteristics just a little bit, but not selection. If they come back and meet again, they simply don't recognize one another, so they do not breed in the wild. And again, that's a type of geographic isolation. With reproductive isolation or sympatric types of isolation, you're talking about isolation in the same spot, it gets a little bit kind of crazy. So I'm going to go through these a little bit fast in terms of some different ways that populations could be in the same place and yet not interbreed. So two major categories. There's prezygotic and postzygotic. Remember, a zygote is a fertilized egg. So before the zygote means that the egg and sperm simply cannot get together. In all of these particular cases, I'll give you some examples, are ways that egg and sperm simply don't meet. Mom and dad typically don't get together in the first place. There could be some other things like gametic mortality that could be happen after sex, but most of these prevent sex from occurring. Postzygotic means sex has happened, And usually there even could be fertilization that's happening, that the egg and the sperm are now in the same place at the same time, but yet for whatever reason, that new offspring simply doesn't get born, doesn't survive, something along those lines. This is different from geographic. Geographic means they cannot meet. Reproductive means they can meet, but something prevents that reproduction from being successful. So, I'm going to move forward. Give me my next slide. Where is it? There it is. Really? There we go. So, an example of this, hybrid sterility. This lovely little creature right here is a mule. It's a horse mating with a donkey. Now, they live in the same place. They're not geographically isolated. They're not reproductively isolated. They can have sex. They can, in fact, have offspring. But yet, horses and donkeys are considered to be separate species because mules are sterile. In other words, even though they can have one generation of offspring, mules themselves cannot reproduce. They're stuck as a last bit generation, and therefore that's not considered to be a viable offspring. It's a temporary sort of solution. So that's an example, hybrid sterility. Why won't this go? I'm so sorry. All right, behavioral. Behavioral is another example of two creatures living in the same spot, thinking about maybe getting it on, but for whatever reason they don't get together. And I've got two examples here of some birds and some bugs. A lot of times when we've got behavioral things, they simply don't choose one another. For example, like my little lizards over here, maybe the blue ones only are attracted to the other blue ones and the green ones the other green ones. Yeah, it's a behavioral. It's kind of a choice that they just don't want to breed with one another. Sometimes creatures have different types of mating dances that if another creature sees it, they may or may not recognize that as being an appropriate mate. Or down at the bottom, those poor little fruit flies. Some fruit flies like to do it during the day. Some fruit flies like to do it during the night. And they, if you have a daytime lover and a nighttime lover, they may never get together. So it's a type of reproductive but behavioral isolation. And that's what this word ethological means. It's behavioral isolation, same kind of idea. They simply don't recognize another type of a mate. Going along with that is that idea of seasonal isolation. Maybe it's not just day-night. Maybe it's month by month. That, for example, these two frogs have different breeding seasons. One breeds in the spring, one breeds in the fall. They're simply not going to meet one another either, simply because they're not ready. Same thing is true with plants. I know we don't think of plants as being sexy, but they certainly are. For example, certain things will have an early flowering season, kind of like the frogs, and things will have a late flowering season. So the pollen, say, from the early flowering plants would never meet with a flower from the late flowering plants. And again, that's a type of seasonal isolation. It's in the same place, so it's sympatric, but they simply don't meet. Ecological population choices are a little bit different. It's almost like a behavioral thing, but it's more like because the males and females are using different parts of their environment. So example, there's fruit flies here. Perhaps they like different parts of their diet. So the males and the females of one type of fruit fly goes and hangs up by the apples. The other ones go out and hang by hawthorns, which is a different kind of a tree. And so those particular males and females may never meet one another. You get the same kinds of things will happen with bugs that live in trees. Some bugs live out at the ends of the tree branches. Some live on the bark. And again, it's just a type of ecological separation. They're using different parts of their ecology, different parts of their habitat. It's not a behavior thing. It's not like they're choosing to do one or the other. They're simply sort of living in a different zone within the same thing. So if you break down the ecology, yeah, they live in the same place. In fact, they live in the same state, but these guys only live in one kind of tree and these guys only live in another kind of tree. That's ecological isolation. Over time, all of these different things can lead to an abundance of new species forming. And this is especially true if we get a new species coming into a new empty environment. And that's kind of what this little diagram on the left here does. That we've got species A that lives on the mainland, and some of those lucky buggers end up over on this island. And then we've got kind of a combination of perhaps geologic isolation, maybe some behavioral, some reproductive, some genetic drift, all different kinds of things. But over time, as this population sort of break apart and move back and forth between these different islands over these numbered 4, 5, and 6 different migration sorts of things, we can end up with what was one species now is what A, B, C, D, and E, 5 different species. This process is called adaptive radiation, where one species spreads out, fans out into a bunch of different species that are all related to that one ancestor. This is especially effective when you get a species colonizing a new area for some reason with lots of empty niches. For example, Darwin's finches was a great example of an adaptive radiation. And this particular process right here, by combining natural selection as well as isolating forces, maybe sexual selection, maybe some genetic drift, you get lots of new things that can play a role in this. So here's our examples of this. Sorry, I think I just did that same slide twice. Oh well. some examples. This is not Darwin's finches. It's kind of a similar sort of one. These are Hawaiian birds that are all, again, related to one particular founder species that are now a whole bunch of different, very specialized. Look at those beaks. Craziness. Bunch of different species. The salamanders of the Pacific Northwest, same kind of thing. One sort of original salamanders, now a bunch. All the marsupials, by the way, of Alaska, and that particular Alaska. Really? There's no marsupials in Alaska. Australia. Thank you. It's late. But the marsupials is an example of adaptive radiation. They're all related to one another. That crazy way of reproducing that they have, they're all close, but they look very, very different. And then we've got some fish and some plants down at the bottom. Again, just types of adaptive radiation that can go on. So here you go. Big ideas in terms of speciation. How do you go from one species to more than one species over time? So number one, you need to know what a biological species concept is, that idea of successful interbreeding. That changing characteristics over time can result in new species for a variety of different reasons. But in terms of that idea of shifting what they look like may change how they interact with one another. So we talked about stabilizing, directional, and disruptive selection as types of selective forces that can be in there. But again, non-selective forces like genetic drift and things like that can also play a role, founder effect and all that other kind of stuff. Disruption, in terms of disrupting a population, could be allopatric, different places, sympatric, same places. And then isolation is that new key. There's a variety of different types of isolating forces that can be in there, and I gave you a bunch of examples from geographic isolation, allopatric, to prezygotic and postzygotic types of isolation, which are both sympatric. And then that idea of adaptive radiation. Once you get into that new ecosystem, that spreading out of different species can sometimes happen in really unique environments, especially empty environments. If you're interested in a 4, you can take a look at some different rates of evolution. People are arguing, sometimes very heatedly, about whether or not speciation happens quickly or slowly. I think there's a middle ground. I think both occur. But those are called gradualism and punctuated equilibrium. So there's some ideas for you to think about. See you in class tomorrow.